Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Altitude, which is our monthly look at the world of air traffic control and aviation. My name is Fran. Thanks very much for joining us today. I'm really pleased to be back in the host chair again, hoping you'll have a good conversation today. Now, this year is the 21st anniversary of the terrible events of the 11th of September 2001, when 4 commercial airlines were hijacked, resulting in the deaths of about 3,000 people. It was a day that changed the world and a day that changed the aviation industry forever. I don't think any of us will ever forget where we were or what we were doing when we heard the news of what was happening. Most of us probably then spent the next few hours glued, horrified to the screens, watching the rolling news coverage. But some people, like those that we're going to be talking to today and like those involved with air traffic control on the day, had to process that news and process that information whilst also managing the implications of what was happening. Today, I'm really delighted we're joined by 2 people who very much played their part on that day, both with really fascinating stories to tell us. So hello to Michael and hello to Shahid.
Hi.
Good morning.
And don't forget, guys, that you can put your questions to our panel using the box on your screens as you're watching. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can during the show. We're going to start with a couple of introductions and a little bit of discussion. But yeah, anything that occurs to you for a question, please feel free to type it. We'll get those through and try and get to as many as we can. So before we get to the memories of actually what happened on that day, Michael, let's start with you. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what your job was in September 2001?
Thank you, Fran, and good afternoon, all. I am currently an assistant professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Florida, in the United States. But on September 11th, 2001, I was the air traffic manager of New York Area Control Center, located in Ronkonkoma, Long Island, New York.
Brilliant, thank you. Shahid, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I was a controller about probably 5 years, valid, on the ocean. And yeah, it was just, a normal day for me, really, we were, somebody had mentioned that there was a light aircraft had gone into the into the Twin Towers, and I was just watching television, and rest, as you probably know, what happened.
Yeah, we'll talk that through definitely. Shahid, just tell me, when you say you're on the ocean, explain to people. We get lots of people watching these podcasts, and they're great, and some people are very much aviation buffs, and some are not at all. So when you say you work on the ocean, tell me about the controlling on the ocean. What does that mean?
So I'm an oceanic controller, and at that time, we had a purely procedural environment. We did not have radar. We used HF for communication. CPDLC, I think, was quite new at the time, had just come in, but with a limited number of message types you could use. And we used time and distance, basically, and obviously different flight levels to separate the flights.
Okay.
We had fairly big separations in those days as well,
Yeah,
and
you've got to keep a lot of space between the planes because we can't see them. You don't have a radar picture like I have at where I work at Sonic. So you've got to do it all procedurally. Brilliant. Thank you for that. So, Michael, I want to start a little bit with you. We're delighted you've joined us from America today. That's really kind of you. So just like today, it was morning for you where it's afternoon for us. So tell me how your day started that day and what you did.
Well, it was a Tuesday morning in September, so it's late summer in New York. It was an absolutely gorgeous day, clear blue skies. And I had spent the previous weekend in Manhattan. And actually, it was my birthday weekend. And my young son, who was in year 1, it was his first visit to the World Trade Center site that previous weekend. On September 11th, I was sitting in my office, and I had decided to stay in my office and allow my assistant to do the operational telecom for the day so that I could get caught up on my work from having been gone for a long weekend in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting at my desk reviewing email when I got a text message that described the fact that there was a possible hijack in progress, American 11, flight level 310 over Albany, New York and southbound. So with that, I immediately stopped what I was doing and went out to the operational control floor.
So it's not the sort of thing that happens too often, a hijack scenario, but it will be something you would have been trained for and you would expect. And obviously you didn't probably expect the aftermath. You would think that would just evolve.
Absolutely. As I'm sure Shahid would, and you know, Fran, that training is an important element in an air traffic controller's career. And as an ATCO, you constantly are training and refreshing your training in all possible facets of what we're doing in aviation. So hijackings, emergencies, and things like that are part of that training process. So there were procedures in place, there was training in place, and experienced controllers in place. However, as you mentioned, we didn't truly expect what the outcome of that would be.
So when the first aircraft hit the towers at 8:46, what sort of reactions happened? How were you made aware of that if you were in the ops room?
I got the first initial notification at 8:36 in the morning. So I immediately went out to the ops room and I went out to the area specialization, area Bravo, that was adjacent to Boston Center's airspace. So I would postulated that if the aircraft was tracking southbound on flight level 310 over Albany, New York, I knew where it would enter the New York ACC airspace. So at that time, I was standing behind a controller in area Bravo, and we were able to find a primary radar target. A primary radar target is a raw radar return. And we were able to talk to other aircraft, and we actually vectored them in the vicinity of the primary target to get a visual report on the aircraft. So we knew it was an American aircraft. We knew it was an American 767, and we knew it was southbound, and we knew it was descending. And it appeared that the aircraft was navigating down the Hudson River, which is the major river to the west of Manhattan, New York City. I postulated again that, okay, if the aircraft is heading southbound toward New York City, perhaps something happened on board the aircraft where they lost communication and they lost their transponder, their ability to track altitude and identification of the aircraft.
Yep.
At that time, we then got a message from the American Airlines Operations Center that they had spoken to a flight attendant on board the aircraft, and she confirmed that it was a hijack, that the hijackers had knives and bombs, and one flight attendant had already been killed and several passengers had been injured. So at that time, we knew it was a hijack. I thought perhaps that a bomb had gone off on board the aircraft, and that's why we had the loss of the transponder and communications. Yep. So I was actually on a telephone looking over the shoulder of the controller, and I had dialed in the New York Approach Control. I was speaking live with New York Approach Control to give them a heads up that this aircraft was heading toward New York and may attempt a landing at one of the New York airports. At the same time, we called up the Newark Airport Air Traffic Controller, which is in New Jersey, just to the west of the Hudson River. I was thinking that the runways there are nearly aligned with the Hudson River, and long runways, therefore, more than likely, if it had to make an emergency landing, it would land in Newark. And I was speaking live to the Newark controller and to the New York Approach Controller when the Newark controller looking out the window reported that the aircraft had hit the World Trade Center. My immediate thought was, we're under attack. At the same time that happened, I heard a controller behind me and to my right say, I have another one. At that time, I warned the New York TRACON and the Newark Tower Controller, because they wanted to get off the phone to handle it as an aircraft accident. I said, don't make any assumptions. This is a terrorist attack. We are under attack. There are more aircraft coming. And with that, we got off the phone and then went over and monitored the flight of United 165 that had departed for Boston also. And the odd circumstances of it was that United 165 actually departed behind American 11 and actually reported us on the initial frequency, hey, we think there's a hijack. We heard something on the frequency. We used United and we vectored him to report visually what American 11 was doing. So odd set of circumstances that the aircraft that we were utilizing to assist us with American 11 actually ended up being hijacked themselves.
Oh my goodness, that must have been such a strange thing to start to comprehend. And
Right.
do you have, you must have had controllers on rest breaks and things like that at the same time. Are you sort of starting to think about how you bring staff in or what you do and what people have seen?
At the time, my initial action was to have our military specialists contact the military and let them know we had a hijack in progress.
Yeah.
And that was principally what we had to do. And then we notified all our surrounding and adjacent facilities about American 11 that was in progress, just in case the aircraft did continue south out of New York ACC airspace.
Yeah.
But then the priority came to tracking United. And again, we watched United turn toward New York, making a sweeping left-hand turn. So my immediate assumption was the target again is the World Trade Center. The transponder was changed to a different transponder code, but wasn't turned off. Therefore, we were able to track the altitude of the aircraft and the ground speed. And we could see the aircraft was in fact speeding up and descending toward New York. I tried to call our regional headquarters in New York City to warn them that a second aircraft was on its way. Unfortunately, over 6 attempts to call, I would get the administrative assistant and she would say, everybody's in a meeting, an aircraft hit the World Trade Center, they can't come to the phone. So that was unfortunately very frustrating for me as I'm trying to warn everybody that a second aircraft is actually
on its way.
And I watched as the aircraft hit the tower. What did surprise me, of course, was that it hit the second tower.
Yeah.
I thought perhaps they would target the same tower as a 1-2 punch to take it down.
Yeah.
So at that time, I knew that something had to be done.
Yeah.
So I declared what we in the United States called a TC0. And that was a procedure that was developed in the event that there was an equipment outage or some major problem at a facility, they would stop providing air traffic control services. For me, I chose to do it because that was the only way I knew to get aircraft on the ground and keep them on the ground. And also, I was trying to deny the attackers their weapons. If they're going to use aircraft as weapons, I'll stop the aircraft from flying, and perhaps we can prevent additional attacks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I want to turn to Shahid. Tell me a little bit, Shahid, about, so obviously it's an afternoon for us when all this happens. So what was your day like initially when you started, and what time did you start work, and how did you find out what was happening?
Yeah, I mean, then I would have been starting, probably, I think the shift should start at 1 o'clock. It was just a normal afternoon shift, you know. I did a session, then went on a break around mid-afternoon time, about 3-ish, and I, you know, we had a restroom right next to the ops room, and people were in there just watching television. There was, you know, TV pictures of one of the Twin Towers, and it looked like a bit of smoke coming out of it, you know, and there was speculation that it was a light aircraft that had actually hit the tower. It looked like nothing at that point, you know, obviously. And we're watching this, and you know, and all of a sudden the watch manager came in and said, "We required back on sector because, you know, the Americans have closed their airspace." You know, and maybe Mike can, you know, maybe confirm this, but what the reasons given was that obviously an aircraft had gone into the Twin Towers, and that possibly there could be more, possibly that were on the ocean, also heading that way, and you know, that was the reasons given at the time, and yeah, we were just told, you know, airspace is closed. Aircrafts are going to have to divert and turn back, and it wasn't as straightforward as that, because aircraft were beginning to request landing slots in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And some aircraft that had gone as far as 40 west, nearly quite far west, you know, had told they didn't have a landing slot, and another aircraft that had just barely just entered the ocean had landing slots in Canada.
Yeah.
You know, and so it wasn't as straightforward as it could have been, you know, because,
Yeah.
you know,
You didn't quite know what was going to happen next, or who was going to get where, and how that would go.
So yes, when it was, and the slots were very, the landing, the parking at the airports, the Canadian airport, it soon ended up that they were full quite quickly, you know, and so so basically we're in a situation where American airspace is closed. There's a lot of aircraft currently in the ocean. They're heading westbound, and obviously a few eastbound as well. It was, you know, it's obviously, as Mike said, we are trained in emergencies and unusual circumstances, but we've never trained for, you know, anything like that before. So it was, you know, I remember sitting down in the sector and trying to make sense of what I was going to do here in this situation, you know, and it was, I was scared because we were getting information that an aircraft had crash landed somewhere. There was other information that, and I don't know where this information came to, but obviously came through the watch manager who went around and said, I think there's just been told a dirty nuclear bomb has gone off in San Francisco. Now, I don't know where this information came from, but obviously it was fed to by someone to the watch manager at the time. But it kind of, you know, it gave me the impression that it was almost like the world was ending, really, you know, and you know what was going to happen next. So
let's ask Mike what happened next. So you've gone to this state of what you call ATC 0. So you're basically in a position where, what does that mean in practice? No more departures and things have to land? How does that actually work?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's, as she mentioned, the airspace was closed. So that meant all aircraft that were currently in the airspace either had to vacate the New York ACC airspace or land, and we would take no additional aircraft into the airspace. And for our viewers, New York ACC has both domestic and oceanic, similar to Prestwick. And I had called the supervisors from all the areas up to have a briefing to let them know what I was doing, why we were doing it, and what actions we need to take from them forward. And I remember the oceanic supervisor asked me, does this include the ocean also? What do we tell Gander and Prestwick? And I said, we're closed, even the ocean. So that unfortunately led to the occurrences that Shahid mentioned, where aircraft had to make tough decisions about, do we continue forward into Canada or do we turn around and go back to Europe? And also from then, I had to make decisions about what are we going to do about this? And I called all the managers from the entire building into the control room floor, and I assigned various duties and responsibilities to each of them. One would be in charge of security for the building, elevate the security to highest levels, escort all visitors out of the building, verify all badge identification for all employees. I had to have one manager I put in charge of looking after the controllers. As you can expect, those controllers in Area Bravo that had to watch this event as it actually occurred, that's a traumatic event. Yeah. And so we actually set up a space in the office complex where we brought in clergy and therapists and psychiatrists to provide support, to immediate support to those controllers. And we had to do things such as, I need to know where all the New York Center employees are, even those off duty. Are they safe? Are they okay? Those on travel status, those in meetings, those on vacation. I wanted to know about those controllers that may have been flying in the cockpits of aircraft. I wanted to make sure that they're all safe and on the ground. So I had to put somebody in charge of that also. So a lot was the fact going on. And in the middle of that is when I got a phone call and I was instructed to get on a national teleconference. And I went to my office where I have monitoring equipment that I can take a look at all the aircraft in the National Airspace System. And I got on a speakerphone, and there's one person on the speakerphone. I knew him, David Knowles, an executive at FAA headquarters in Washington. And at that time, we started tracking a third hijacked aircraft that had departed from Newark Airport. And that aircraft made it as far as Cleveland Center Airspace in Ohio, and then turned around and came back, was going eastbound. And we started tracking that aircraft. And it turned out that that aircraft was also one of the aircrafts that departed Newark, and we were using it as assistance for vectoring and for visual identification of American 11. And it was also hijacked. And at one point in one sector in Area Bravo, we had all three of the four aircraft at the same time, and little did we know all three of them would end up being hijacked. And we tracked that aircraft. We saw it crash into Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and my assumption at the time it was a controlled flight into terrain. And then we have a report that another aircraft was hijacked. Now, aircraft had departed Washington Dulles Airport, and more people joined this teleconference. And one of them was a controller from Washington Dulles Airport, and she started counting down the minutes and miles from the White House. It started out 10 miles from the White House, 9 miles from the White House, and continued down to 1 mile from the White House. And then the aircraft was reported making a sweeping right turn away from the White House, which didn't surprise me, because for those who haven't been to Washington, D.C., it's a very small building. And so it's not a very likely target. And the Washington Monument is right in front of it. So you would have to engage in a very steep dive to crash into it. I thought perhaps the Capitol, but it overflew the U.S. Capitol building and then made another sweeping right-hand turn and went into the Pentagon.
Wow. Goodness. So Shahid, we talked, obviously, yeah, you're certainly probably going into a bit of shock. You're a bit scared. You're trying to work out what to do. So we do train. We know we train for emergencies all of the time. And that's really, something that we have to do as controllers. But how does that work? You'd never train for anything like this. Would you train to ever shut your airspace?
We've had times where we've had mass evacuations, for example. And in terms of there's maybe a fire alarm's gone off, so you've got to vacate the building, everybody except essential staff. So in those situations, you just avoid any aircraft that are carrying that are obviously already en route. Say if it was Gander, that obviously were evacuating. Obviously, you'd try and avoid Gander airspace where you could. What's there's already there, but you would try and route aircraft around there into, say, New York's airspace and Stansmere's airspace or Reykjavik's airspace to avoid Gander. And that is maybe not that complicated, really, to do. You move what you can. So there's a procedure for it. And which you follow, and evidence and understanding of that. I think this was, unique. It was not something that had ever been we'd been trained for, and so you're sitting there thinking, I need to come up with a plan,
Absolutely.
Because the aircraft are, I was getting phone calls from my colleagues in Gander saying, let me know this aircraft's turned back, this aircraft's coming back. And there was a lot of uncertainty because a lot of aircraft that were in the ocean at the time, some just come in, some shortly exiting our airspace, were still waiting on of news of a landing slot at one of the Canadian airfields. So there was all that uncertainty. You're trying to devise a plan of a mass turn back of all these flights, but you're not quite sure who's actually carrying on, who's not, and that was the situation I was in, and I started looking at. We have procedures for when we have aircraft in an emergency,
yes.
A diversion turn back, right? And at that time it was an aircraft in emergency would adopt a contingency procedure where they would be 30 miles offset from the track that they were flying, and usually descend to a clean level below the other aircraft, and then that was a kind of standard kind of contingency procedure.
Yeah.
I think that I was working. I think I was working flight level 330 and below that day.
Yeah. On
the sector. Obviously, these days that's not that busy. It wouldn't be that busy a sector, but that back in the 21 years ago, there was a lot of DC-10s, lots of TriStars, lots of old jumbo jets. So that was quite busy. those kind of levels were, you know. So I thought to myself, right, if I could offset all these aircraft by 30 miles to one direction, I could bring them back, and eventually they will all be 60 miles separated, because that's obviously the separation we had at the time. And then I would fit in the other aircraft that were carrying on westbound on their whole degree tracks, and the ones coming back from coming eastbound from Gander. And I had a look to the north, whether it was a right turn would be the best idea. There was a lot of random flights to the north, so I sort of said that wasn't going to work. I had a look to the south, and I worked at the fact that actually offsetting. I think the tracks that day were through the middle. The oceanic tracks were, so I offset everything 30 miles to the south, and so what basically ended up was the traffic pattern moved about 30 miles to the south. I then there were some future conflicts that were kind of in the future. Yeah. Resolve those when we had the pattern, evolving, and eventually everything, from what I remember, was once we'd had the pattern of aircraft turning back, we were able to integrate the ones that still carrying on westbound, and we were able to facilitate a level change or a reroute to make sure we had standard separation, and eventually it all came together and it worked,
And it clearly did. I'd be interested. I worked a morning shift on the day it happened, so I wasn't working when it happened. But I talked to one of my colleagues here who did, and I know that he recounted to me that again he had just been in the ready room and was watching the rolling news and actually saw the second aircraft go into the tower, and then went back into work and was trying to process all of that. But I know that they were then told to be quite strict about what was spoken about on the RT, so they were told that they were only allowed to say there has been a security incident and you're not allowed to go over the ocean, or you have to turn back. And obviously there are aircraft, so you're dealing with all the ones turning back from America. There were also aircraft sort of part way up to Scotland to go out your way, and aircraft coming over from Europe trying to access those tracks as well, and all of those aircraft have got to go somewhere. So did you get any instructions, Shahid, about what you were supposed to say, allowed to say, or anything like that?
No, I think the information I had at the time was maybe quite limited. I didn't see any aircraft, obviously, on the footage on the television at the time, but I didn't see anything going into any of the Twin Towers. I was told obviously afterwards by my watch manager, obviously, an aircraft had fallen into the Twin Towers. But I think that I was pretty much focused on, apart from the kind of stories coming into the ops room, I was pretty much focused on getting the aircraft turned back, and it was only, when I finished my shift and went home, did I actually see the full horror of the second aircraft going into the Twin Towers.
Yeah. Do you remember how that made you feel when you finally went home at the end of that day?
Oh, I mean, to be honest, I felt really good because I had done my job. I'd done my job. I'd managed to get everything back safely. There wasn't any aircraft were all separated. Nothing got close to each other. The plan worked, and I was pleased with the work, because my initial reaction was, what do I do here? It was, I'd been watching unfold on the TV. I just thought it was just a light aircraft. Everybody was assuming it was a light aircraft, and all of a sudden, you're called back by your watch manager to say that the American airspace is closed, and you've got a mass diversion of aircraft, basically. And it was once I got it working, it was reasonably okay. But at the time, I wasn't sure what I was going to do.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Absolutely.
something. And I just I looked at something, I tried it, it worked, and I was reasonably pleased with what and I did feel good going home about it, and yeah.
that you'd done your job that was required.
I didn't get a gold medal like Mike did, but you know,
but you probably deserve one. So Mike, tell me about the end of the shift then. So you know, what time were you supposed to finish? You've obviously got all of this to handle, and you know, if it's anything like this, you're going to have an awful lot of stuff to do paperwork on and things at the end of it. But you know, so to tell me, you know, after all these things have unfolded and you're now clearing your airspace, how long did it take to get that clear, and then what do you have to do from there?
It did not take that long to clear all of the airspace in the United States. And for those who've never seen it, you can go to YouTube and you can look it up. There is what we call our traffic situation display, and actually shows the system clearing. And it took less than 30 minutes to get all the aircraft on the ground. And after that point, wow, the only aircraft that were flying were military aircraft.
Yeah.
But there wasn't the end of the shift for me.
No.
I did not go home for 10 days.
Wow.
I slept in my office and I worked continuously for 10 days because, believe it or not, as difficult as it is to shut it down, it's even more difficult to start it back up again. So how do you prioritize which flights should get airborne first? How do you ensure that they are secure flights and there won't be any additional attacks? That was the monumental challenge that lay ahead of us. But also, as you mentioned, Fran, paperwork.
Yeah.
I knew that this would be a criminal investigation of the highest levels. So I immediately instituted a process where everything was secured, and we developed a chain of custody for every piece of information that you could possibly have as a result of this event, because I knew that at some future point, there was going to be FBI agents knocking at my door to get a look at this information. So that took quite an effort to do that. But then I set up a small command center in that conference room and remained on that conference call. And that conference call is still going today, 21 years later. That is now called the Domestic Event Network and is used for security of the national airspace system in the United States.
Yeah,
but
brilliant.
Before we want to go further, I do want to give, number one, my thanks to Shahid for the great job he did that day. I understand completely the challenges that you had to put together and overcome in order to get those aircraft safely back. But also, I want to thank you on behalf of Prestwick Center. As we were in that little conference room next to my office, a package arrived to the facility, and it was a condolences book from Prestwick ACC. And that meant so much to me personally, but it also meant a tremendous amount to the men and women in the oceanic areas at New York ACC. So thank you for Prestwick for doing that.
Shahid, I think, you know, do you want to respond with that one?
No, thank you, Mike. I mean, like you say, you know, we're trained to do our job, and it was amazing that day. People who were off work came in to see if they could help as well. They'd seen the news on TV. They asked if they could come in. Is anything that they could do, whether it was just getting drinks and sandwiches, because you were on the sector until, you know, it was the aircraft were flushed out of the airspace basically. And so yeah, it was a shocking event, and it was a challenge. And but yeah, thank you, Mike. I mean, obviously,
I think air traffic is a big family across the ocean.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I want to get to some of the questions. We had some questions been coming in from various people, and there's an interesting one right to start with, and I want to, because it was something you mentioned as well, Mike. So we've had a question from Conrad that says, was there any CISM intervention done after the September the 11th, and if so, do you know how much it was helpful? Now, for anyone who doesn't know, CISM is critical incident stress management, which is something certainly I know was implemented in here, you know, around that sort of time and after that time, to help support people who've been through a traumatic event. And today it's a peer support program rather than a CISM program. But, you know, Mike, you mentioned that you brought people in to help support your controllers who are obviously going through a very traumatic situation. Was there any formal thing for that, or was that just something you felt had to happen at the time?
Well, I knew it had to happen, and it had to be timely. I wanted to ensure the well-being of all the controllers before they left at the end of the day. The critical incident stress management process was in place at the time, and it was a combination of peer and professional support available to the controllers. But I knew that that takes time to activate, and I wanted to do something more informal but faster in order to provide assistance. The CSISM did come to the facility about 12 hours later. They did not actually meet with the controllers on duty in the facility. We did all that off campus to ensure there wasn't any additional stressors of being back in the building where they had to watch these events occur.
Yeah, and did you find that subsequently, did people find it hard to go into work, or did people sort of, and everybody's reaction was slightly different, I'm guessing?
Right, everybody's reaction was different, but similar to Shahid, anybody who was off duty, immediately they rallied to the cause. So it was tremendous to see the men and women in New York ACC come together to overcome the events that occurred for us. But even more for us, those 10 days of work, when I finally got off work, the first thing I did is I got together with my son in first year and my wife, and we went back to Manhattan because I wanted him to be able to truly appreciate and understand what happened, actually go down to the World Trade Center site and see the 30-story pile of rubble that was once the Twin Towers. And
yeah, I don't think any of us will ever forget that.
Right.
Yeah. Shahid, what about over at Prestwick? Was the support available for you? Did people, help?
I don't recall that, at that time. I mean, the thing is that our experience is maybe a bit different from what Mike and his fellow controllers were facing, because it was more immediate. It was happening, to them, and whereas, we were watching it on television, and so I think our experience maybe be a bit different from obviously Mike, but certainly I don't recall any critical stress management. I don't think anybody requested it, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
But like I say, our experiences, we were a bit remote from, we were watching it on TV, obviously, whereas it was real and it was happening.
Yeah.
To the people at New York Centre.
Yeah. So more questions. We've got, how did NATS determine which flights to turn back to the UK? This is from David. I was on Delta 37 from Gatwick. I went on to Gander, but I believe that there were planes not far behind us that went back to the UK. So Shahid, I know you talked earlier about some aircraft were getting slots in Gander and some weren't and things like that. How did you get that information, and what did you do with it? How did you decide?
Well, obviously the pilots were requesting were making the request through company. So I suppose they were just waiting for the company to get back to them with what they could get from, in terms of landing slots from Canada. But they filled up very, very quickly. And that bit, the decision wasn't getting made by us. It was, the decisions were made elsewhere. We just had to deal with the flights, whether they were continuing or they were coming back basically into UK airspace.
Yeah. So
and obviously, as the person who submitted that question, is some flights were, had just entered the ocean and had slots, and others had gone all the way across were told they didn't have a landing slot. It was bizarre. It wasn't any logic to it, but I guess it was first come, first served. I guess and
I guess the airlines would know about what aircraft had what fuel and where they might be able to get them. And I imagine there's all of that. And I imagine that would have been a very difficult time for pilots as well. So, one of those. So Fiona asks us, how do you not let the emotion of the moment cloud your ability to focus on the job in hand? So I know you talked a little bit about that, Shahid. Just fill me in a bit more. How do we, when you're controlling, how is it almost that nothing else comes into your head?
I don't know. It is a strange thing, We you could have a bad day, and when you come into work, you're totally focused on it.
Yeah.
It just is. That's the way it always is. You could have had a bad morning. Something could have happened. You get into work and you're just completely focused on your job. it's one of those jobs where you can leave that behind, you know, and I you know, we had a job to do, you know, and we got on with it basically, you know, and you're not thinking that there's hundreds of people in those flights. You don't think that. If you thought that, you
never control.
Exactly.
I agree completely. Yeah, absolutely. But Mike, obviously when you're supervising, maybe is it slightly different? Does it feel slightly different? Do you know, because you haven't necessarily actually got to talk to the aircraft, you've got a lot of other communicating to do, but again, how do you not let what's happening in the emotion of that cloud what you're having to deal with?
Well, having been trained and worked many years as an air traffic controller, it's similar to what Shahid shared, and that is you develop the ability to compartmentalize and focus on the task at hand. That is your priority, and you know the consequences of fulfilling those priorities are significant. Additionally, on the day it actually happened, I say the one emotion that I felt the strongest was anger. I was anger that somebody would take something that I love, aviation, and turn around and use that as a weapon against my country. That angered me. And part of that anger then provided that impetus, that motivation to see it through, to do what I need to do to stop any additional attacks and be there in terms of defense of the nation.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you. We've had a question from Janet that says, how easy was communication between the various US and in fact other centres during the whole unravelling of the incident, and has it improved since then? Have we done different things? What have we got? Have we learnt lessons? Mike, how did you find it for you? You've got obviously communications set up with adjacent centres?
Absolutely, and I called the air traffic managers at the adjacent centres to let them know what was going on, the true facts, because as Shahid mentioned, there was a lot of speculation on all the various news broadcasts about what actually was going on. And I wanted to be able to ensure that they have what we call the ground truth, that what is actually going on in the system. And absolutely lessons learned from that day. And I mentioned earlier about that teleconference that I was on.
Yeah.
Now, every major air traffic facility in the United States monitors that continuously, 24/7, along with the various branches of the military and Homeland Defense in the country. So there is an instantaneous communication process that we now have available to us since that day that has been used tens of thousands of times to track incidents as they occur.
Yeah. So we've had a question from Stefan that says, Hollywood portrays chaos in scenes where controllers attempt to decide which aircraft might be hostile or might be compromised or might not be. Was there any potential process in place for identifying any other compromised aircraft? Was there anything on your side, Shahid, that were you told to look out for anything different or anything that we don't already know?
Well, not really. We weren't aware of any other potential hostile aircraft, but I think that it was something that obviously been speculated on, that some of the flights actually that were potentially, you know, heading towards, you know, American airspace could potentially have, you know, hijackers on board or you know, and so I think that I don't know. I was told at the time that that was a consideration, you know, and why airspace was closed as well. But in terms of communication, you know, that it was a normal day. There was communication going on between all the different centres involved. It wasn't an issue, you know, in terms of you know, I think we had good comms all day long, and we were, you know, kept a certain amount of, you know, not fully up to date, you know, it was obviously constantly on our job at hand, but I think we had the information we needed to do our jobs, basically.
Yeah, and I know when I spoke to my colleague Kevin about this, and he was saying when aircraft were returning back down, you know, sort of into the south of England, and obviously trying to fit wherever they could, the thing he remembers most is the tone of voices of the pilots, who were obviously, you know, very scared of what had been happening, and particularly pilots of American registered aircraft, American aircraft, were feeling very obviously vulnerable, and that thought that, you know, is my plane going to be next? And that he said, you know, the desperation in voices to just get on the ground as soon as they possibly could to avoid any kind of situation where their aircraft might be next. And that was obviously they were getting information from company and things, and that must have been, I think, incredibly difficult to deal with. So I mean, Mike, you already talked a little bit about being told about the next hijack and the next hijack. What were you watching from then on? Were you obviously looking for other potentials?
Well, certainly we were looking for other potentials, but of course we wanted to get every aircraft currently in the air on the ground. And we utilize the fact that if a pilot was non-compliant, if they were argumentative to air traffic controller's instructions, then we could assume that they could be a hostile aircraft. So we had numerous U.S. fighter aircraft airborne almost immediately after, unfortunately, the aircraft hit the World Trade Center. And for those aircraft that were seemingly not compliant, we actually intercepted those commercial aircraft, and we informed the pilot it was either divert to the immediate airport or you will be shot down. And that occurred hundreds of times across the country, because you can imagine, this is unheard of for an airline captain to suddenly being forced at an airport that they do not have any services available to them if they were to land there. They want to go to either their destination airport or to a diversion airport, and not to the closest airport nearby. So what finally happened is that we had an ACAR message sent out. And for those who don't know what ACARS is, it's basically a text message that can be sent to the cockpit of every aircraft. So all American carriers sent out an ACAR message that said, hijacks in progress, secure the cockpit, divert immediately to the closest airport. So it's probably what the pilots in the UK were reacting
receiving.
ACARS message.
That would make sense. That would make sense. We've got time for one last question, which has come to us from Warren. I don't even know how you would answer this, but I'll be fascinated to listen. So have a good think. Knowing what you know now, would you have responded any differently after 21 years of reflection of what's happened? Let's start with Shahid. Would you do anything different today?
We have a different system these days. We had no surveillance capabilities at all then. We had a map in front of the sector. That was it. We had to. You had to then try and envisage in 3D where the aircraft were, because you had no other way of doing it really. But now we've got ADS-B. We've got surveillance. We know where the aircraft are. I still think though, to be able to handle a mass diversion of flights, back to back to Europe, you would still need a procedural solution, I think. But at least with ADS-B, you have a bit more surveillance of where the flights are, what they're doing. I do think though that separations have become a lot smaller now. We've gone from 10 minutes down to 14 miles now in trail, and aircraft are, bunched up a bit more at the optimum levels, So I do think that, it may be a bit more trickier, but I think about having the surveillance, the ADS-B surveillance would definitely make a big difference to the job.
Mike, what about you? Would you have reacted differently now, looking back on it?
Of course, I've had 21 years to think about that. And I have thought about it a lot, as you can imagine from the events of that day. And the only thing I keep coming back to are those 13 minutes where I attempted to call the regional headquarters to alert them about the second aircraft that's hijacking. That was very difficult to have this knowledge and not be able to share it. As you saw in the news media, they're reporting the aircraft accident. I knew we were under attack, and to try to share that. And I have thought so many times about it. I wish I had some way of getting through to somebody during those 13 minutes, but unfortunately I can't think of an alternative I could have employed at the time.
Wow. I could talk to you two gentlemen all day. I really could. And I'm sure some of our listeners would listen all day as well. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today, so I'm going to have to stop the discussion there. My absolutely huge thanks to Michael for joining us from the morning in America, and to Shahid for joining us this afternoon for what's been a really, really fascinating and incredibly poignant discussion. Thank you to everyone who's watching today. Thank you for posing brilliant questions. I'm sure there'll be more. As ever, if you've got any feedback for us about this episode or any other episodes, or any ideas for future topics that you'd really like us to cover, you can email in at info@nats.co.uk, or you can tweet us at @nats. Keep an eye on social channels for details of the next show. Thanks very much to both my guests for today. It's been really amazing for me to be part of this. Thank you very much, and goodbye.